In today's video, I have some really simple, fast and easy gouache painting tips. So if you haven't used gouache, it's a really fun medium. It's a type of opaque watercolor. The name was coined only a couple of hundred years ago, and probably in the last century and the first part of this century, it will have been known as designer's gouache. That's because it was used by commercial artists making advertisements before the days of things like Photoshop and graphic software, when it was important to get flat, uniform colour, but you literally had to paint it by hand. Gouache paints are what was used. If you used paints at school, you may have used some form of poster paints. That's kind of a cheap version of gouache. But the type of paint that gouache is dates back, in fact, to caveman times, Egyptian tombs. All of that is one of the earliest types of paint, basically pigment and binder. So it's the same as watercolour, but it's just prepared a little bit differently. It tends to have different levels of binder in, and the grind size is larger. This gives more opacity. It has some advantages over watercolour and some disadvantages. It's a medium that I really enjoy. So in today's video, I'm going to paint a picture. Now this is an actual painting I'm working on, so I don't know if I'll get it finished within this video. It's not a step-by-step, but if you'd like to see the finished painting, just pop over to my Facebook group or to my Instagram. I would say pop over to Twitter, but Elon seems to have filled it full of Nazis, so I'll no doubt be leaving that platform soon. Now, if you enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content all about watercolors and drawing. And let's get on with tip number 1. So tip number 1 is don't do too much drawing. So we're going to do a little bit of drawing on this picture, just so that I can see where I'm putting things. But remember, gouache is to some extent opaque, depending on how thickly you use it. So there's a danger that if you do a lot of fine drawing, details will disappear. So let me show you how much I'm doing on this painting. So here's what I'm going to paint with my new gouache paints. Now, this has actually been severely photoshopped in that I've removed the background from it. The reason I did that is because these stems of flowers actually were not very close together. So they're just growing up some crappy old wall that is next to where I park my car. They come up every year with no help from me. I spend most of the summer trying to sort of get my car in and keep them upright, and they're always falling in front of my car. So what I did was I photographed some of my favourite colours, and then I took the backgrounds out on a graphics program and sort of squeezed them in closer together. Not because I particularly want them on white paper. I am going to put a background in, but just so that I could get as many flowers with as many different colours as possible. So we've got these white ones with a touch of pink. We've got these ones here, which are sort of cream, and they've got a more burgundy inside. Now, for the drawing, what I've done is I've started just to draw the stems. So with flowers like this, when you just need an idea of where they're going, the stems are a great place to start. Now, you can't actually see all of the stem. And this one here, you can see hardly any of the stem. But I've put the whole thing in because that's just going to allow me to place them where I want them on the paper. I'm not too worried about getting them in exactly the same place. I'm not going to draw, for example, all of these little bits on the inside. What I'll do is I'll get a rough idea of the shape of the outside of the plants, and perhaps a shape of things like these buds here, and maybe 1 or 2 leaves. I may even put some more leaves in. And I'll think about how close up to me they are. This one, for example, is much larger. The others, are further back. And that will affect how big or small I do them. And that's going to give this sort of look of 3 dimensions. But I don't want too much detail, because with an opaque paint, it's easy just to cover that detail up. I could do all this, drawing all of these details in here, and then just find that the paintbrush ended up covering it up. So to an extent, we're going to be painting by eye, but I do just want to have enough on the paper that I can position things. So let's look at this stem here, for example, and down near the base, I've got a really large flower. Now, the thing with flowers is it's a good idea to get an idea of the center of the flower. That helps the flower to face in a certain direction. So I'm going to have a look at the center here, and it's going to be sort of somewhere around here. And once I've drawn that, what I'll do is I'll just remove this stem. Now, I can paint over the pencil in this case. It's not like watercolor, but removing it's just going to allow me a little bit more ease, shall we say, in order to figure out where my drawing is. And I'm just going to be getting a rough idea of where these things go. And then there's another flower that comes around the top here, so I'll be putting that in. I'm going to get on and do the rest of this drawing, just putting in the absolute basics. So I've done as much drawing as I'm going to do. Now, it's very scruffy, it's rather inaccurate, but it gets the feeling of the flowers. I've drawn very few leaves, only one or two that are up the front, and that's because I'll just get lost in all these lines otherwise. I just want a basic layout of where I'm going to place the flowers, but there's something else I need to do before I start painting. So tip number 2 is the same as with any medium. I want you to swatch your colours, especially if you're new to painting in gouache. I've actually got gouache paints and watercolour paints with the exact same name, the same pigment numbers from the same manufacturer, and the colours look different on the paper because the light reflection is different. So it's really important before starting that you swatch your colours. So these are my new gouache paints. I'm going to swatch them now. I do often make larger individual swatches with a lot more details on, but today I just want to swatch the colours just to get a feel for which colours I've got, because later on I'll need to decide which ones to use in my painting. Now I've got a titanium white. I don't need to swatch this one. I was playing around with them yesterday when I was making a YouTube short. So I've got watercolour here. This one is some of the gouache paints, and the white was placed on top. So we can see this titanium white is super opaque, and they aren't always. So I don't have to worry that it's not going to cover dark colours. So I'll swatch the other paints, and even though I'm just putting them basically on one sheet, I'm going to make sure I swatch similar colours together. So what I'll do is I'll start with the primaries. I'll swatch the yellows, the reds, the blues in groups. This is really important because there's not much point having a red over here and a red down the bottom here. And you know, if they're close together, you need to be able to compare them. So you always want to swatch colours that are similar next to each other so that you can compare. It enables you to choose better colours. Once I've swatched the primaries, I'll swatch any secondaries. I think the only secondary I have is this spring green, and then I'll swatch the neutrals and the black. So I've had a good swatch of my colours here. You can see I've put them in colour groups, dripped a little water on this one. So I've got Hansa yellow, that's very similar to lemon. I've got a lovely sunny cadmium yellow. I've got a yellow ochre. Very excited about this one here. This is a quinacridone magenta. Not only is it going to be great for those dark pinky purple flowers, but also if I dilute it with white, I know it's going to make a lovely soft pink. I've got pyrrole red, a colour which looks scarlet, but when watered down is somewhat coral. I've got a nice true cadmium red. I've got an ultramarine and a French ultramarine. I've got a spring green, a buff titanium, and a black. For tip number 3, again, just like watercolours, we're going to choose a limited palette. Now, this is not something that I have to stick to through the whole painting, but I'm going to start with a limited range of colours and only add those that I really need to. This is going to give the whole painting a cohesion and make everything hang together. Let me show you how I do it. So let's talk about choosing a limited palette for this painting. Now, this painting is a gouache painting, and that's important because it means that I have the option of diluting colours with white rather than just using the transparency of the paper. So I've swatched my colours, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with mixing them a little bit and just look at them, just decide which colours I should choose. Now, typically with a painting like this, I'm going to need a lot more colours, and if it was a full garden painting, even more colours. If it had maybe red poppies and purple flowers and yellow flowers, you could see I might need many different colours. It wouldn't be enough just to have one yellow to mix from if there were 3 different colours of yellow flowers. If it was a sunset painting, however, I might only need 3 colours. So the idea is to choose a limited palette to work from. Stops me from getting overwhelmed. It means that everything is a little bit cohesive. It does not mean as I go through the painting I can't add more in, because I may find at some point that I just have a colour that I wasn't planning for or wasn't thinking about. And this actually is why drawing is so important, because I actually drew this painting by hand, even though because it's a gouache I've drawn quite loosely and not been exactly true to what I'm seeing. Nevertheless, I spent a lot of time looking at the photograph, and that gives me the opportunity to assess the colours in a way that tracing would not. So let's look at the colours that we might choose for this. Obviously, we've got the pinks of the flowers, we've already got some white paint, and then we've got greens and a few sort of yellows and kind of muted colours too. I also have to think about the background. I'll probably stick to something like blues or cool greens for this, and these are the colours that I have here. Now, because these are new paints that have been sent to me, they're a limited range, and so there are one or two things that aren't included. I don't have a Payne's Grey, for example, and most notably there is no cool blue, no turquoisey blue, no phthalo blue. Now, I know the manufacturer, I've spoken to them, they do have this planned, but for the time being I'm going to work with these colours, and I'm actually going to choose less than this to start with. Now, the first one that's most obvious, of course, is this one here, this quinacridone magenta. I mean, it's just perfect. So we're going to use that one. Now, I've got other pinks as well. Now, if I add white to this, I will get these lighter shades. And of course, I might get some other pinks too, but it can end up looking a bit samey. Now, with these pink flowers here, I'm very inclined to try and get a different type of pink to the one that I would get if I just add white to this colour here. Now, reds like this cadmium red typically don't make good pinks. However, this Pyrrole red, when white is added, should give me something interesting. So I'm going to swatch this first and have a look. So I'm just being lazy here and popping them straight on the paper. And we'll add a little bit of white. I only need, a tiny amount of paint just to see how it's going to look. And I've got a colour here that I think is going to be really useful. You can see that it could possibly do either of these pale pink or these flowers here. So I'm going to use this one and this one. I'm definitely going to use the buff titanium. There's a definite hint of it here. I could mix this colour from scratch, but why not use it if I've got it? I've got lots of greens. I'm going to need some yellows. Now, I don't have a cool blue here, so I'm going to use my green as a starting point because it has some phthalo in. And I'm inclined actually to choose both of these yellows. I'm going to start without the yellow ochre, but I may add it in later on. I don't think I'll be using the black. I don't think I'll be using the cadmium red. I'm also going to choose one of these blues to give me some different greens and some background colours. This is a French ultramarine. It's got a touch of red in, so it never makes very fresh greens. I love this cooler ultramarine, so I'm going to start with this one. So how many colours is that? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are the colours I'm going to start with. I'm going to see if I can do the whole painting with those colours alone, but I won't be afraid to add others in if I need them. At this point in the video, can I just pop in and ask, if you're enjoying this video, could you please click the like button? The thumbs up just helps with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. I have well over 200 videos all about watercolour painting, drawing and mixed media, and you can subscribe to the channel for free. For tip number 4, let's look at which brushes we can use for gouache paints. So let's talk about what brushes we use for gouache painting. Now, the short answer is anything you like. So you can use watercolor brushes. Now, because I am mainly a watercolorist, I'm used to using watercolor brushes. I always use synthetic ones. They have a little bit more spring than animal hair, and obviously because I'm a freaky vegan, I don't use animal hair brushes anyway. But even if it was not an ethical concern, I still prefer the synthetic because I like the spring that they have. Now, when it comes to acrylic brushes, the bristles are much stiffer. This is quite a cheap one here, it's molting. So what I would tend to do is I would tend to use my synthetic watercolor brushes, and then if I need sort of a dry brush effect or something where the brush strokes are just going to be a little bit more visible, because you can use visible brush strokes in gouache painting in the same way that you can with acrylics and oils. It doesn't really work with watercolors, it just ends up looking a bit scruffy, but it looks good with gouache. So I can use for example, I can use this softer brush here, but also I can use a stiffer brush too, and we can get some of those dry brush effects going on, or just pick up 2 lots of paint on the same brush. I've got a flat brush here. This one's a round brush. They call it a round brush even though it's got a point. I can use either and they are interspersible. It can be quite fun actually to paint your whole gouache painting with a small flat brush. Again, a small flat brush is not something that works well in watercolors, but it can give quite an interesting effect. If you like those acrylic type paintings that end up with sort of almost lots of square marks, then that's something you can experiment with too. For me, I'm mostly going to use my watercolor brushes. If I feel I need a stiffer brush at some point, I'll bring in an acrylics brush too. Now for tip number 5, this is more like painting with acrylics. We're going to knock out the white of the paper. There are very few mediums where the white of the paper is left on show and it looks fine. One of those would be watercolor, another one would be printmaking. But for gouache, we don't want any gaps showing, so we're going to start by knocking out the white of the paper without completely covering up the pencil lines. So I've started painting in the background here, and what I need to do is knock out as much white paper as possible. It would be my preference to go across the whole painting, but this paint is pretty opaque, I'm finding, and so if I do that, I'm going to lose all of my drawing. Now the drawing is quite loosely done, so that doesn't mean that the flowers are going to stay the exact same shape. So as you see here, I'm not worried if I go across a bit of an edge. What I've done is I've started with the ultramarine and a little bit of white. What I sometimes like to do with a painting is go in with sort of blues at the top, and then as I come down, I'll add some of the Hansa yellow in, and that will give us the impression then of some greens lower down. And just taking out as much of the white paper as possible because I don't want there to be gaps later on. And I'm allowing some colour variation as I come down, trying to avoid hard lines. You notice I had one when I started the camera. That's because my cat was harassing me and I had to stop painting. So I'm going to come down, adding in this background, going roughly around the flowers. If anything, I'm erring on the side of going into the flowers slightly so that when I paint them later on, I can take the paint out a little bit and I don't end up with that gappy white background that literally never looks any good in gouache. Now there's a rule in oil painting called fat over lean, and it's talking about the thickness of the paint. We're going to use the same principles for our gouache paintings. Let me show you how and why it's done. So I'm using a little bit of water with my paints here. It's important to put this first layer on quite thinly because it is a principle, just removing the cat hair there, it is a principle with gouache painting that you go what they call fat over lean. This is going to help with all sorts of things. It's going to allow you to put thicker layers on later on without the paint being too thick on the paper. And I mean, you can even in extreme circumstances end up with paint that cracks if you put it on too much and too thickly. So therefore you want to start with these lighter layers lower down. And we're going to start just adding in a touch of yellow here. And you see now how we start to get that impression. Maybe some background greens lower down. Now for our next tip, we're going to use not too much water. Unlike watercolor, gouache paints are designed to be used at full strength. Sometimes they do need a little bit of water to moisten them, just like you might use in acrylics painting, but we don't want to use too much. So I've introduced my green. I want to go for, a completely different color. This is something I often do actually, is use a lighter color for the stems of plants. Just helps you to show the difference between them and the leaves. And you'll see that the paint is fairly thick here. It's quite opaque. Although I'm keeping a little bit of water around, I'm not using too much water on my brush because this isn't watercolor, so we want that opacity. Just going to add a little bit of dark to the side of the stems just by going in with a bit of the ultramarine. And putting the stems in will give me a chance to have almost like a skeleton for this painting before I go on to the flowers. Now for tip number 8, we're going to do something that isn't possible, or at least is very difficult with watercolor painting, and that's to use 2 colors on the brush at one time. It's kind of the gouache version of wet into wet. So with gouache painting, we can do a sort of wet into wet equivalent in that we can put more than one color on the brush at the same time. So I'm going to start these dark red flowers here, and I can start adding the color like this. But I can also pick up more than one colour on my brush at a time. So I can have some white on there as well. And look at these beautiful brush stroke effects we can get. Now, in order that I keep the white pure, I tend to actually go in with a second paintbrush. So in other words, I have 2 paintbrushes on the go at the same time. You can also do this very effectively with a flat brush because you can actually pick up one colour on one corner of the brush and another colour on the other corner of the brush. I tend to be quite lazy with brushes. Once I've picked up a brush, I tend mostly to do the whole painting with it unless there is some reason for me to change. Now, tip number 9 is to buy more white paint than anything else. So whenever you choose your gouache paint, you want to get extra white. And that's because unlike watercolor, we do actually use white paint and you'll get through quite a lot of it. So the thing with gouache is you are going to get through so much white paint because although you use a little water, white is pretty much your mixer. And you'll find as well that, within the palette, it easily gets polluted and then your white isn't white anymore. I want to mix some white in. Now I've got green in it, so I need to put more white out. And you're just going to get through it faster than all the other colours. Also, you'll find that the paints themselves actually dry a little bit darker. And so where you think you have got a pink that's going to show up against the background, then you might find that it doesn't really show up. And so you need to put more white on it. And you're just going to get through a lot more white than any other colour. You also want to make sure your white is of the best quality. Even if the rest of the paints are slightly cheaper, white is opaque and cheap whites are not going to be opaque enough. You're going to lose that lovely chalky effect that you get with gouache. Now for our next tip, we're going to squeeze the paint out only as and when we need it. Gouache paint dries rather quickly. You might have wondered why it's only available in tubes when it is indeed water soluble and will re-wet. So let me explain. Now you might be wondering why I'm squeezing out the paint as I use it onto this big dish here. This is actually, if you're interested, this is an IKEA serving dish. It's not a palette, but makes a fantastic ceramic palette. You might be wondering why I'm not sort of squeezing all the paints out into a palette like this watercolor one, where I've got them all around the outside and they'll last a bit longer. The thing with gouache is, even though technically it re-wets, and if the paint dries in the palette, I can re-wet it, it never re-wets as effectively. You really need to be using the paint quite sticky. So if you re-wet it, you're almost treating it like watercolors. You're not going to be able to get the paint thick enough. The other thing that happens, and I found this out when I first got gouache paints, I put them all around a little palette and they all dried out, and then I picked the palette up next day. Not only had all the paints cracked, which is a common thing that happens with gouache, but they all fell out of the palette. They don't stick like watercolor paints stick. And so you're much better to squeeze the paints out as and when you need them. Don't allow them to dry unless you need a tiny colour hint, like a little bit of shadow on the edge of something. They're not going to work effectively once they've dried. For tip number 11, I'm going to suggest that you don't use too many layers. One complaint about gouache is that it tends to get rather muddy and that you can't layer on top very well, and underneath layers disturb really easily. All of this is true, and the simple way to avoid this problem is not to put too many layers on. Let me show you how many I use. So I'm painting these pink flowers here. Now, if I was painting in watercolor, I'd do them in multiple layers. I'd perhaps put the light color on and then I'd let that dry and then I'd layer on top. I'd be working up in layers to get the darks in. But layering doesn't work too well in gouache. You can have an underneath layer and then a top layer and perhaps a third one with a few details in, but you really don't want to put 4, 5, 6 layers on because these paints disturb very easily, and as you try and paint on top of them, the underneath layer is going to be re-agitating and it's going to be lifting up and muddying up all your colours. So therefore, when you work on each part, you want to put as much in one go as possible. So let me demonstrate. Let's put this petal in here. I'm going to go on with the very lightest colour, like so. Now, because if I keep rinsing this paintbrush, I'm going to lose an awful lot of paint. What I'm going to do is grab a second paintbrush. I'm going to put some colour in like this. In order to get these fine lines, rather than letting everything dry and painting on top, I'm actually just using an embossing tool to sort of do almost a sgraffito effect. You can actually just use the end of your paintbrush. Mine's rather blunt, but that works too. And what you can do is you can sort of scratch through the paint and also drag the paint up, and we get a very good effect this way. The paint's still wet. I'm going to clean that little brush again. Now I'm going to go in with some shadowy colour and take this around this bottom edge like this. Now, because this isn't showing up very well against the background, it may be that later on I put a few more darks in the background just to finish this painting off and allow these to come forward. But I really want to get some white on the edge here. So again, while it's still wet, I'm going in with my little brush and some white paint and just adding this to the edge so it starts to show up more. And you see here, I've painted all of these effects in one layer while the paint's wet. And that avoids me having to keep working on top and disturbing underneath layers. The only thing I'm going to add to these flowers later on is these little stamen things in the middle, because they've got lots of little dots that sort of sit on top of the petals. So for our next tip, we're going to put the details on at the end. Now, in watercolor painting, if you had something like fine lines or fine stamens in the center of a flower, you might put those in at the beginning, perhaps with masking fluid, reserve them, something like this. But with gouache, we're going to put those details in at the end. Now, if this was a watercolor painting, I would certainly have reserved the centers of these flowers with masking fluid or just by painting round. So they would be pretty much the first thing that I thought about because they're the lightest part of the painting. But with gouache, you want to work the other way around. So we're going to put fine details on last because light paint can be put on top of dark paint. And so I have the opportunity here to go in with fine details at the end. But I still want to make sure I cover up all of the white paper. The same will actually go for the leaves as well. So whereas if I have a dark leaf with light veins, I would in watercolor reserve those veins at the beginning. In gouache, I'm going to paint them on top of the dark leaf after it's dried. So do let me know in the comments if you've used gouache paints yourself, if you enjoy using them, if you're perhaps going to have another go or a first go with them now. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. If you're watching this video just a week or two after it's gone up or immediately after it's gone up, I do have an offer on a gouache painting course. It's one of my mini courses, so it's just a little painting tutorial. And I'm offering it half price for the month of August 2023, so it's only going to be $9. And if you miss that offer, it's still good value anyway. And you can do a full gouache painting with me. And if you're interested in the paints that I used in this video, again, don't forget to check out the video description where you can get a discount using my code. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to enjoy my gouache painting mistakes. You can watch that video right now.